Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my AM reading video update for Friday, July 26th, 2024. I've finally gotten around to making one of these AM reading videos on a Friday, even if it's only my second update of July, but what are we going to do? I'm just going to go ahead and go forward from here. I got some books to talk about at least. I usually start these videos out with talking about a short story from a collection I'm reading from, but usually that short story is from a literary magazine. But instead, this week I decided just to continue with Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage by Bette Howland, which I read the first story, a flash fiction story from, in my Try a Story tag I posted a little while back. I'll link that video down below. And I decided to, use this section to move on to the next story, to a much larger story. And the story is called Blue in Chicago. And I think, as promised with this author, most of these stories are going to be about Jewish American Chicago families in the mid-20th century. This one, the narrator is a young woman who lives on the South Side during really strained realities. There's, with what would be referred to as race wars and just, a lot of crime and poverty. And she is from a, white Jewish family, but she lives on the South Side, and that causes a little strain between her and her family. And most of this story takes place around a wedding when the woman's cousin is getting married to some sort of Gentile. They can't seem to decide if, I guess, the service is Catholic or not. And it's about sort of the colorful characters of her family, especially her uncle, who is a police officer and just is also sort of very abrasive and confrontational. There are a lot of names in this, so sometimes, it's difficult to sort of keep track of who's who. The woman's mother is giving her some flack for not being married, even though she had been married and was divorced. There's commentary on how many of, the family members actually don't marry into the faith, even if it's, I guess, still kind of weird in a way for them, except for the sister, the main character's sister, who is living in Israel. So I think in a way it's just sort of like brushing across the surface of these issues and trying to give like the texture of what it might be like to live in Chicago around this time. I feel like I didn't get, much more than that in terms of, the character drama I like. I'm not sure, but it definitely gave sort of a fleeting sense of place and just a large cast of characters on one day of a wedding. Next, I did finally finish Florence Adler Swims Forever, which was my page 112 tag for June, so I'm very happy to, get this off. And I think I was pretty much done with it, near the end of it, I should say, in my last AM reading video. And so there's not much more to add. I'll just briefly say that this story is about Florence Adler, who in 1934, she's a very accomplished swimmer, but she ends up drowning in a freak accident in the summer near her parents' home in New Jersey in Atlantic City. And her mother especially decides to do something crazy where she more or less tries to keep Florence's death under wraps until her older daughter Fanny gives birth. Fanny is in the hospital with a high-risk pregnancy after having lost the first baby, like a baby the year before. And we kind of go through cycle through a lot of the characters in Fanny's, Florence's orbit, I guess, or anyway, mostly her family members, both, both parents, Fanny's husband, Fanny's daughter, and then we have Anna, who is a German Jewish refugee staying with the family, and then Stuart, who is the Gentile swim coach who had feelings for Florence and then stays involved in the story. And there's, it's not just sort of, this tense tightrope about trying to keep the secret from Fanny. They also have a lot of subplots going on. And in the finale, I guess I felt like, there's sort of a convenience to how the subplots tie up exactly when the main plot of Fanny giving birth and then, we'll get out of this purgatory happens. So I guess that in a way to me made me like take a little bit of a step back. Like there's like a little bit of, convenient shoelace tying going on. But certainly as I was reading the story, I was very engrossed in the characters. And I mean, certainly this situation just lends itself to drama, even with Fanny never knowing throughout the story, which, you know, takes place over 3 months. She never knows the truth. But she has her own stuff going on, and everybody else has, you know, Florence stuff and then their own stuff going on. And it just sort of reveals the cracks in various ways within this family and the world they're in. And I was very engrossed, largely while reading it. Next, I finished Lublin by Manya Wilkinson, which I had started at the beginning of the last damn reading, but I don't think I was as far along into. This is a 2024 historical fiction release, and it's a very short book, but which took me much longer than I anticipated to get through. I probably should have anticipated that, though, looking back on it. It's a book about three young boys, like I guess early teens, Elya, Kiva, and Ziv. They are Jewish, you know, members of a Polish shtetl, a little town in the Pale of Settlement in the early 20th century. Kiva's uncle is a paintbrush seller. Elya is, you know, trying to get ahead, working for him. And so he sends them off to nearby Lublin to try to sell the brushes, except they never actually get there on the road. They just aren't able to, they get lost on the road quite quickly. And it's very much about their travails, and it turns a lot into sort of the banality of evil and the banality of sort of being alive in the wilderness in that time period. The evil I refer to as largely anti-Semitic evil. In a way, it kind of reminded me of Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff, except I was more taken with this. I mean, maybe some of it was having, you know, this is something closer to my own, you know, family's experience or what have you, but I also feel like the characters were much more complex, and so that made the story more engaging for me. But it was just kind of harrowing in its way, you know, just you know, what they were facing on the road from other people, and just from, you know, the realities of being lost without enough food and shelter and that sort of thing. And Wilkinson did sort of do that thing where, you know, it's like, I'm writing historical fiction and we are in, you know, the thread of time, and so she gives little hints about, you know, what might actually come for these particular characters or the particular world they're in, because for the Jews of Poland during this time, it's a fraught time for them anyway. I mean, they're just, you know, they're living, you know, it's, you know, the landscape is even itself, I think, a little uncertain between, you know, who's ruling Poland, and a lot of times it is the Russian Empire, and a lot of the boys in town were forcibly conscripted into the army, and that sort of thing. And everyone from, you know, the Russian infrastructure to the Cossacks, there's just a lot of violent anti-Semitism, and this is, you know, in the, you know, tail end before most of these people would be wiped out. And I found that, you know, harder to read this reality. And there was even a wedding scene where they actually did stumble finally into a Jewish wedding, and Wilkinson decided, you know, for the texture of the wedding, that she would talk about every person's fate at the wedding, and, you know, most of them ended up dying, you know, 40 years later, 30 years later in the Holocaust in various ways. And I was realizing as I was finishing this up right before Netanyahu came to DC, that this was relatively bad timing to be reading this. I was already in a little bit of a state after, you know, reading about this trauma, and then I had to go into work that day, and I work on Capitol Hill, and because Netanyahu was in town doing his, you know, little pony show, you know, my workplace was barricaded. It was like a fortress, you know, the streets were closed, the police were everywhere, and it just was, it was a really tough day. And I guess if I could go back, maybe I should have, you know, thought better about actually reading this. Maybe I should have gone for a longer book that I could have gotten through easier if it was a little, I don't know, less personally fraught, as I was waiting to see what would happen. And then in Union Station there were pro-Hamas, anti-Semitism, graffiti, and flag burning and all that. And I was like in my fortress, but you could kind of feel like there was danger at the door. And so that's a bit of my personal state around this book and that day. And I'm just, I guess, trying to move past it now. And I'm not even sure I can talk about this book entirely, on its own merits or not. And, maybe that's apropos for the course, because this book is definitely saying I'm part of the thread of history and I don't just stand alone. So that continues into the modern day. I feel like I have to talk about something much lighter and much more escapist after that one. So the next book I'll talk about is Cool for the Summer by Dahlia Adler, which is YA romance. Much, much, much nicer. And this, in fact, was my BookTube spin pick for quarter 2, so I'm also a little bit late on that. I've already made my quarter 3 video, but I will link BookTube spin quarter 2 down below in case you want to see that TBR game. Anyway, this is a YA romance, as I said. Our main character is named Larissa, although some characters call her Laura. I feel like, Dahlia Adler was maybe a little, I don't know, with that, but that's silly. Anyway, it's basically a queer Grease retelling of sorts, where Larissa goes to this high school in New York State and has had this crush on a football star, Chase, forever, and kind of lives in his shadow, cheering him on at his games with her, a group of friends who have this social hierarchy among them. Then her mother ends up taking her to the Outer Banks. Her mother works as a executive assistant for this, important rich guy, Declan. And Declan has a daughter, Jasmine, who is staying with him for the summer, because she's a child of divorce. And Jasmine and Larissa really hit it off, and quite surprisingly end up, their relationship goes from being, very platonic, and where they sort of, boost each other up in some ways, like, Larissa's helping Jasmine with her photography, and Jasmine is helping Larissa with, I guess, her self-perception and her looks, and also like teasing out of her that, she has this secret desire to be a romance author. And so, there's this strong sort of bond between them, and it turns into something romantic and sexual, where it's like this heady summer that we see in flashbacks, and then Larissa kind of feels like it just ended, and it feels abrupt, but, she's going to go back to her real life and move on. But it turns out that Jasmine has transferred to her school, quite shockingly. And this is especially a big deal because Chase, finally, after all these years, starts to notice Larissa, in large part because she came into her own at the beach house. And so now, like, instead of just being a, passive follower in his midst, she, is a person with her own personality. So that's some really nice commentary in there. I mean, anyway, the conflict obviously is which one will she choose, and she's kind of going on this path where she's following the dream she always had to be with Chase, especially, around him winning football games and, the homecoming, and they're both, named homecoming queen and king, and it's, it's the aristocracy of high school reality. Like, I can't help thinking in a way, I mean, I know Jane Austen is a lot more, complex in its way, but there are social hierarchies between friend groups, like especially like in Emma, I think, and it just reminds me of how high school is organized in this world, because Larissa is very keen about how she fits in with her friend group and how she fits in with Chase and the football games, and then she's like holding on to realities about what your confidences with what you look like and talk about social, social culture and that sort of stuff. So in a way it feels sort of similar, that romance, I think, kind of works well in these sort of structured hierarchies, or at least that's how I understand them. Of course, the, very annoying thing about this book is that these characters just don't talk to each other. I mean, the conflict would go away if they actually spoke to each other and were honest about their feelings. And it even sort of, negates the authenticity or genuineness, I guess, of their feelings if they're not able to talk to each other until the very end, except that maybe I can give everyone a pass because they're high school students. Maybe I could do that for them. I don't know. You know, it was a fun story as it was going on. It was just, the characters, popped in their ways. I mean, I think it's, not deep about any of these issues, but I think what I do like about these sort of social reality stories is they do talk about such issues about, like, finding yourself and what you really want, and finding, some sort of strength in relationships, which is really nice to read about. And none of the characters were too one-dimensional, I think. Between Chase and Jasmine, neither of them were assholes. Larissa's friend Shannon, she could be a little, egotistical and self-centered sometimes, but she, was able to kind of come back from that as well. So, I mean, that was nice. It's also, of course, a novel which, takes queerness, LGBTQ issues as a given, although Larissa is able to, sort of, have a moment of, I never realized I was attracted to girls, and what does this really mean? And I guess I was glad that, it didn't mean she had to fit an exact template, because sometimes I worry about these identity politics, meaning you have to sort of fit yourself in like a puzzle piece where, these issues of relationships and sexuality are more complicated and nuanced than that. And I feel like Adler did a pretty good job with that. So I really did enjoy this story. The ending wasn't that surprising about who she would choose. And there was even a little bit of Jewish content in here, because Larissa's kind of nominally Jewish, and Jasmine, her mother, does these elaborate Shabbat dinners. So, that was why it was on my booktube spin, in fact, as a Jewish romance, even if it was nominally Jewish. And, these sorts of things, they're formulaic stories, so I'm not looking for like a whole bunch of surprises, but I also love character work, so I feel like for me, maybe I'm realizing that romance could really work for me, because, they really can be a lot about relationships, even if some of the aspects of the storyline, especially with, not talking to each other, can be a little eye-rolly, but still, overall, it's very sweet and fun. To move back into some darker waters, now I am reading Ruby by Karen D. McIntyre. This is a book that made it to the top of my Goodreads TBR, so I have a New Year's, a year-long resolution to, knock those off. And this is a self-published book that I picked up years ago for the one and only time I went to the Maryland Writers Association's annual conference, which I might want to see about doing again this year. And anyway, all members could sell their own books, and I thought, at the time I wanted to support people, and this one sounded, interesting enough to me, so I put it on the list, and then, finally it got to the top of my list. And anyway, this is historical fiction also taking place in the 1930s in Virginia. And our main character, Ruby, is coming home one night on the bus. Well, she used to live somewhere else, out of state or elsewhere in Virginia, and she lost her job and was coming home to her parents in rural Virginia. And she meets this man who, sweet talks her and is very kind, and ultimately hoodwinks her. Like he, says, oh, well, my brother will be around and we can give you a ride, rather than you having to wait at the sheriff's station or whatever. But it turns out that, this man Ray and his brother Joe are sex traffickers, and so they're doing, human trafficking with her. And so, she, there's a little bit of tension, like it when she ultimately, gets to the car and so forth. But by that point, it's kind of too late, and she isn't able to fully understand or grasp who they are until she's, passing out from the drug they're giving her. So they're, she wakes up in a horrible situation where they're, sexually abusing her, and then they are hoping to, sell her off to like a harem or something. And apparently they have a kind of big business going, and I guess, I don't know, I'm quirking my eyebrow a little, although in one scene with Ruby's parents and their local sheriff, he says there are a lot of girls that have gone missing recently. And I don't know, maybe their thing is that they go around different, small rural towns in Virginia, and in that time period it's harder to trace people down or something. But anyway, their intent is to sell Ruby off, but then she has an accident, she breaks her leg, it doesn't heal right, and apparently that makes her less marketable. So at this point of the story, she's kind of there as a housekeeper and occasional, sexual object for Ray and Joe and friends and so forth. And she actually recently escaped at one point while they were gone, and then was recently dragged back. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's supposed to be about the strength of spirit, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I'm automatically, drawn in by that aspect, and the writing is relatively easy to understand, and, I want her to escape this, horrible situation and these horrible people. I do think the writing is a bit rough. There's a lot of long exposition given in, her internal dialogue, and that's not the way people think. It's just a way for the author to, get us up to speed. So it's pretty unnatural in that way. I also think the pacing is a little confusing, about time passing, and like the only way I know how much time is passing is when she tells me, and that's not the greatest. So there are some ways that maybe the self-published nature of this book stereotypically kind of stands out, but I still feel like it's easy to read, and maybe in its way, even though it's a harrowing story, it's pretty easy to, root for Ruby to get out of this and just sort of be invested in that way, and I'll report back. And the final book I'm reading similarly made it to the top of my Goodreads TBR. This is Stolen Beauty by Laurie, Lica, Albanese. And this is historical fiction, which also takes place during the Holocaust. So I don't know, maybe I should question this. I could put it aside, but for now I think I'm going to keep going through it. And I'm in early days, where it's a dual timeline story. The first one does take place in Vienna in the 1930s, right after the Viennese or the Austrian government allows Hitler to come in, and quite quickly after that, Jews are being rounded up and such, and our main character, Maria, is a Jewish woman, and she's attempting to, flee, although right now it seems like it's a bad situation. She's at her uncle's house, and the Nazis have just come to arrest him, and the cook tells the Nazis that she is in the house, so it does not sound that great. In the second storyline, we go to one of Maria's ancestors at the end of the 19th century, who I think she's going to be involved in an art storyline, if I remember what drew me to this book, but right now we're getting a bit of her childhood and the tragic death of her older brother, who was the one who sort of encouraged her to, keep learning, even though, academia was something that her parents more or less wanted closed to her. But it seems like Adele will maybe break the mold a little bit. I'll have to see. And, you see a little bit of the tension in her storyline, too, between Jews and everyone else in Vienna, except that technically during that time, I mean, Adele's family is very assimilated and so forth, but they're still, they're still slightly ostracized. That's where I am with this one, and I'll certainly go on a bit more of a journey and have more to say about it in my next damn reading. But that's all I have to say for this video. I should get up and get to work already for this Friday morning. I actually have a pretty fun weekend, a long weekend coming up. I'm leaving on Sunday and then taking 2 days off after that to go to the beach. Some family friends invited me to their beach house, and I'm very excited because I actually haven't been to the beach in a couple of years, so I've missed it. I live nearish to the Atlantic Ocean, and I'm going to Delaware to, near Rehoboth and Bethany Beach in that area, which I've grown up going to. So anyway, I'm very excited. I am hoping I might be able to do some filming while I'm there, not only of beachy stuff, but of reading stuff for BookTube. But in the meantime, I hope to squeeze in one final video before I leave, and I think it'll be my mock read sci-fi list. I was just talking about my 2024 historical fiction list, but I also have some 2024 science fiction releases I'd like to talk about, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.